Hello, it's Reija, and long time no see. I've been in a little bit of a funk with filming and a lot of things have been happening. School has been starting, world's going to shit in a handbasket, and yeah. But I'm back now, hopefully, and I will be sharing with you my July reading wrap-up, just as August is finishing up, so look forward to my August reading wrap-up sometime next week. But before I get started, just a reminder that there will be some links in the description for various charities. I would urge you to take a moment of your day to pick a topic to care about and educate yourself on things. For example, I have recently been researching the protests in Thailand and the protests in Belarus. So, you know, just even if you can't help financially or signal boost, it is still important to stay informed. So I urge you to do that. But now let's get started with the reading wrap-up. I'm gonna split this into 3 parts. So first I am going to be talking about comics and manga. Then I'm going to be wrapping up the short stories that I read in July. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the novels. And I will leave timestamps in the description so you can jump around the video to see what I'm talking about in any given moment. So yeah, let's go. The first thing I read in July was My Solo Exchange Diary Volume 1 by Nagata Kabi. I have previously read My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness by the same author, and I have thoroughly enjoyed that. I felt that it truly represented my experience with depression and like coming to terms with my own like sexual identity and having anxiety and how to deal with negative emotions and stuff like that. I felt like it was very representative of my own experience, so I really enjoyed that. And this volume was much the same. I didn't think this covered any new ground. It's basically just a continuation of Nagata Kabi's own experiences and her struggles with trying to move out of her parents' home, trying to navigate professional life and her personal life, and all that that entails, especially as a person suffering from mental illness. I thought that this was okay. I didn't gel with it the same way as I did with her previous work, mostly because there were times when she kind of went on with these philosophical interludes, but she kind of stated them as if they were facts. And it was kind of like there were a bunch of what I like to call Dr. Phil moments, where basically someone tries to sell as fact and professional opinion something that is most likely complete quackery without any sort of proof or source to back it up. So I ended up giving this volume 3.5 stars. I liked it. It's very hard for me to rate this because it is a biography, a memoir, but at the same time I feel like those Dr. Philish interludes can be quite harmful if people take them to heart and don't question the validity or the plausibility of those statements, you know. So that's why I gave this 3.5 stars. Next thing I read was Mooncakes, illustrated by Wendy and written by Suzanne Walker. And this has been quite the booktube darling, I think. Most of the people that I have seen talk about this have loved it, or at least liked it. And I didn't. I really did not like this story. I feel like it has very good intentions. It has non-binary rep, it has an elderly queer couple, it has a main character who is hard of hearing or uses hearing aids. It has various body types, and like it has visual representation that I think is sorely needed, but at the same time I don't think that having representation necessarily makes a good story by itself, and I feel like this was very weak in terms of storytelling. It was paced very strangely, like you would have this sort of high stakes moment and then they would be undercut by characters starting to talk about their love lives. Like, for example, there is a scene where a character has called the main character to come over to her house because there's something weird going on at her neighbor's place. And when they come around, they see something weird and possibly dangerous happening at her neighbor's place, but instead of addressing that situation straight away, they start talking about the main character's love life and feelings towards the other main character. And it was filled with these types of scenes where a moment of action and a moment of high tension was undercut by a scene that was completely inappropriate for that situation. And also, I just did not like the villains. Like, talk about mustache twirling, sometimes literally, like villains who were evil just for the sake of being evil. I thought that it was just lazy, and like, I don't always need my villains to have like backstories or like these complex moral quandaries or whatever. Sometimes villains can be villains, but please make them at least somewhat interesting and like compelling to look at. Like, the designs were like boring, the like backstory what of it was given was sort of like okay, boring. So yeah, I just didn't gel with this book. And to make matters worse, the art style is not my favorite. It was muddy. The character proportions shifted and changed from panel to panel. The characters would not stay on model. The backgrounds would change perspective, and like furniture would change sizes, and it was so jarring to look at. Like, it wasn't consistent at all, and I was like, you know, you are having a rough time when you're constantly like, I was constantly doing this, like closing the book, putting it down and just sighing and staring at the ceiling because I was so frustrated with what I was reading. So I ended up giving Mooncakes by Wendy and Suzanne Walker 2 stars, which is pretty much the lowest rating usually that I give graphic novels in any case, because I usually like account for the art and the story. But like, yeah, I was not enjoying this at all. But if you like witchy stories, this is a story about a young witch and a non-binary werewolf having a romance, and it has a elderly queer witch couple. If you like those things, you might enjoy this. It just definitely wasn't for me. Next I read Die Volume 1 by Kieron Gillen and Stephanie Hans, and this was, I think, okay. First of all, the art style in this is phenomenal. It is very painterly, very sort of like a hybrid between like chalk pastel kind of art and oil colors, but it's all digital. And I thought that it was very well executed. It was dark, it was high contrast, it plays with this palette of blacks, reds and whites with a splattering of like muddy teal, and it is very industrial, and the art and the color palette really reflect the industrial nature of the world. And it's interesting because it takes place for a little bit in the real world, which is very muted, very much like blues and grays and sort of sepia tones. And then when the characters are transported to the fantastical world of Die, the character art becomes much more colorful and it becomes much more vibrant, and then you get the red, white and black color palette. And it was very cool. It is basically a story about these, it is a portal fantasy. It is a story about these kids who got stuck in a D&D game when they were teenagers, and they were there for 6 years and nobody knew what happened to them. And when they come back, they can't talk about their experiences. And when they are adults, they are summoned back to that world again. And it pretty much tries to subvert a lot of role-playing and tabletop role-playing tropes and some of the more problematic elements of having role-playing campaigns where you, for example, have whole species of enemy that you are just killing without any conflict or without addressing the situation. This comic tries to address those aspects of the hero's morality, pretty much. Like, it tries to navigate this idea of what it means to be a hero, and are you truly a hero if you do reprehensible things, and how those reprehensible things affect the people who populate that world. And this idea that is there such a thing as a victimless crime if the world is imaginary in a sense. So it's very interesting. I will say that the first volume was very sort of info dumpy. It tries to go all in. It tries to pack all of that information in the first volume, like here, like let's go. This is the pilot episode. I will tell you every little thing so that you know how to navigate the next volumes. And I personally don't like that sort of approach. If you remember, I read Isola Volume 1, which really doesn't hold your hand and kind of drops you in and gives you just the necessary information for you to understand each scene and then builds up on that. I tend to prefer those types of approaches to storytelling and world building. This was very much characters talking, explaining things, and interspersed with various action scenes. It also sometimes tries to be very meta with, for example, there is a cameo from J.R.R. Tolkien in this comic, and I was like, okay, this is a little bit pretentious. This is just a teeny tiny bit pretentious, but I was still intrigued and wanted to know what was going on, and I especially want to know what happens with the main character who is who is a man in the real world, but when he enters Dai, he becomes a woman because his character is a woman. And there is definitely something that the author is trying to explore with that dynamic that gets hinted at in the volume. So I'm very interested about where that is going. I ended up giving Dai Volume 1 3.5 stars. It was interesting. I am looking forward to reading the second volume, but it wasn't perfect. Then I read LaGuardia, written by Nnedi Okorafor, illustrated by Tana Ford, and colored by James Devlin. And, oh boy, this was a mixed bag for me. Because in terms of writing, I think Nnedi Okorafor does a very serviceable job writing about the immigrant experience and the prejudices and the struggles that a lot of immigrants have when they are trying to emigrate. And it talks about like undocumented immigrants as well. And if you have seen the movie District 13 that discusses South African apartheid through having aliens, basically, this is kind of similar in a sense that it discusses immigration through having alien characters. So what if there were aliens and aliens were also emigrating to Earth and also to various countries in Earth? So in that sense, this is a story that I have seen done before, like the conceit of, you know, aliens being the thing representing the other, I have seen done before. But I think Nnedi Okorafor did a good job of writing it in a way that it was consistent. The story moved forward in a good pace, and even though I would have wanted some more character development and some more not tension heavy scenes between characters with just like characters having a conversation, I still feel like it was a very tightly written story, especially considering that this was a one-volume graphic novel. So yeah, writing-wise, this was yeah, pretty good. The art, I will say that Tana Ford has the most dynamic sketches. Like, I read this graphic novel and then I went to the sort of behind-the-scenes portion, and Tana Ford had her initial sketches there laid out, and they were so dynamic and cool, and that made me wish so much that this graphic novel was done in black and white, or they had gone with a different colorist, because Tana Ford's art, I'm sorry, James Devlin as a colorist just did no favors for her initial concepts. The way he colors the panels makes them feel very cramped. He uses a very muted color palette, and the way he uses highlights makes the characters' faces look super plasticky, because he seems to use a combination of dodge and overlay layers, which makes for that very 2000s early Witchblade aesthetic, which I despise. And that's why I was constantly put off by the colors in this volume, because everything was muted, everything was sort of plasticky and artificial and cramped. Like, you would have these sprawling scenes and they would just look claustrophobic, which they didn't look in the original sketches, and I was so bummed. But this was a pretty good graphic novel, aside from the colors. I was still entertained, I still liked it. I gave this 3 stars. If the colorist would have been different, I probably would have given this 4 stars. Like, just, this needed more vibrancy, this needed more sort of like earthy tones juxtaposed with like metallics and stuff, and it just needed some more oomph. This would have benefited from something like a more digital watercolor feel almost, I feel like, especially because a lot of the alien life forms are sort of like plant life-esque, so I don't know, I was just not happy about the color situation, so I gave LaGuardia 3 stars. And then I read Beastars Volume 1 by Paru Itagaki, and I liked it. I have previously watched the Beastars anime series, which I also really adored. Like, it's this close to becoming one of my favorite anime series of all time. I just need to see the second season to, like, fully embrace that statement, but so far so good. And so I've been really excited about possibly picking up the manga. And the manga is actually quite different from the anime. It is not as soft, it is so sketchy and sort of like the art style is almost stream of consciousness in a way. Like the lines are really sketchy and fluid, and like Paru Itagaki plays around with proportion and plays around with movement and anatomy, which is actually really interesting because she clearly has a very good grasp of perspective and anatomy, because she can twist it to her will in a sense and make it work in her style. I really appreciate her artistic skill. Like, she has a very good technique. The story for a pilot, I think, was not the most coherent. Like, I feel like this is a monthly seinen series, so a chapter is published in a magazine each month, and the first volume is like, I think, 6 chapters combined into one volume. So I'm thinking that if I was reading this from month to month, the first chapter would definitely hook me in, because it starts with a very like visceral dark action moment, but then the couple chapters after that sort of like fizzle out that tension that was in the first chapter. So in terms of like pacing and giving your readers a sense of what the world is like, this first volume is kind of a hit and miss. It does that, but I just felt that it didn't fully go there. Like, I still don't have, like, if I was basing my opinion just on this first volume and not the anime, I think I have a sort of advantage having watched the anime before, so I know what the world is like. But if I went into this without having seen the anime, I would have a lot of struggles to understand what was going on. But I'm still super intrigued about what's coming. I'm enjoying the character interactions, and I'm always a sucker for these types of dystopians imagining human interactions and human history and human morality through animals, and these are like actual animals. Like, what if animals were humans, is essentially. Like, they still have their animalistic tendencies, but they have to live according to human morals. So that's interesting. I gave Beastars Volume 1 3.5 stars, and looking forward to picking up the next volume. Next up, I read a bunch of short stories because I was reading up for the Hugo Awards for this year. So I'm just going to go over the short story nominees that I read, and then I'm going to talk about another little collection that I read. So, starting with Do Not Look Back My Lion by Alix E. Harrow. This was the first short story that I read, and also my least favorite. It is basically about this barbarian society that's constantly in a that is constantly in war. It's basically about this never-ending expansion of an empire, and I just have to say that I'm kind of bored about this whole idea of a barbarian nation conquering every other nation from its wake and not bringing anything new to the table, or not having any other resources, or not acclimatizing to other ways of being, because, you know, endless war is not good in the long run, especially if you are constantly, like, I don't know, it just, like I'm trying not to go on a tirade about American imperialism in this sense, but basically this short story establishes a world that is constantly having these soldiers going to war, and basically children are being conscripted from birth to go to war. And it is about this healer woman who is trying to prevent her wife's last child from being taken to another soldier and taken to die on another battlefield. So it is basically about this thwarting of destiny, like, can you break the chains of violence, essentially, type of story. And I get that, but at the same time, like, this is not how real world operates. Like, you can have cultures that are very violent and are, like, you can have cultures that value certain types of feats of violence and prowess and stuff, but usually that's not all a culture is. So to have this sort of idea of this barbarian culture that is basically nothing but warriors and nothing but demeaning of anything that is not warrior-like, I just was like, but no, this like, show me a place where this existed. Like, it's like cultures are so complex. What makes a culture is more complex than this. So I was just very unenthused with this story. I just felt that it had a very lazy premise and a very lazy execution. Those were my thoughts, essentially. Then I read a catalogue of storms by Fran Wilde, and this is basically about a world where humans have broken the weather, and weather is essentially attacking humanity by way of various storms. And it is about these people, a cast of people who are what society calls weathermen, and they have the ability to name the storms and like basically catalog them, and that way people can fight against the storm. You know, you have to name the thing that persecutes you before you, like, you need to recognize the thing that is persecuting you before you can fight it, essentially. And it is sort of like a metaphor in a sense, like, are these really like storms? Is this truly weather, like climate change and stuff? Or is this like civil unrest? Is this human upheaval? Because a lot of these storms are named like are named after like emotions and things. So I think that the storms and the weathermen are sort of like an allegory for this sort of activism and like injustice and that being fought. I thought that it was interesting. It was kind of it kind of went a little bit over my head. It kind of leaned into the allegory and into that metaphor too much for me to come to really care about any of the characters much. So I think it was interesting. It played with interesting concepts, but in the end I don't find myself thinking about this story very often. Then I read 10 excerpts from an annotated bibliography on the cannibal women of Ratnabar Island by Nibedita Sen, and that title is a mouthful, so I had to check my notes. This was my favorite story out of all of them. I basically, this was what I voted for, and part of the reason is that I am a sucker for meta and sort of fake academia type stories. This is a story that is told through an academic source list. Like, think about an academic paper and having quotations and source lists in that academic paper, and you basically have this story. Like, it is told chronologically, like you have these excerpts from various different sources that are all like fake media, essentially. And it's like going through these generations of women who were forcibly taken from their island and like by a colonial power. And it is about the lives of these women, and it talks about the blending of supernatural and the real world, like how magical were these women, are they magical at all, and stuff. It was so great. Like, it is so short, like it's like what, 3 pages or something, and it's so quick to read, but it packs such a punch, and there was endless things to examine and analyze, from the dates and the years and the titles of the quotes and the actual like, or the titles of the source materials and the actual quotes from them. It was so great. Like, I feel like the way it was executed was masterful. To have such an impactful story that is a story of a multi-generational family trying to find their footing in a culture that doesn't want them, but also like not being able to go back to their own culture and their own like original roots because they don't belong there either. And it's told in such a short span. Like, I urge you to go and read this story because it was so good. And I love me some meta stories and fake academia. I love that. I love that so much. And then I read Blood is Another Word for Hunger by River Solomon, and this story has very graphic depictions of violence, of giving birth, and like real painful birthing scenes. So keep that in mind if you want to read it. I will say that like I enjoyed this story, or like, how can I say that I enjoyed this? This story is about survival, about vengeance, about trauma, trying to come to terms with your own past and your own pain in a world that would punish you for those things and would punish you for basically freeing yourself. Even though if you look at things from a modern moral standpoint, the main character is in the right, and even anyway, it's a story about it is a story about a character that frees themselves from slavery by killing their slave owners. And because she kills these people, she has to give birth to an equal number of people that were previously killed, so that it's about balance. And it's about this idea that even if you take vengeance, will you be satisfied with it? It's about this idea that even if you avenge yourself and take vengeance on people that have hurt you, the violence done to you doesn't actually disappear. And it is about living with your own trauma and trying to grow past it and trying to heal, essentially. And I thought that the ideas and messages behind the story were really powerful, but at the same time I felt that the main character was very nihilistic. So I feel like that sort of nihilism doesn't gel with everyone. So I could see how people wouldn't necessarily think of the main character as likable, but if you think about all of the things that she has had to go through, I think you would become a bit of a nihilist yourself. And it is about this juxtaposition between this character with this boatload of trauma inside them and the first character that she gives birth to, who has this endless optimism and vibrancy because she has gotten a second chance in life. And yeah, it was really interesting, and I feel like if you have a personal connection to the themes of this story, it will really pack a punch, and it will really impact you when you read it. So yeah. And the last short story nominee that I managed to finish and read was And Now His Lordship is Laughing by Shiv Ramdas. And this is about colonialism, imperialism. It takes place during World War II in Bengal, and it goes through the policies that Churchill put in place, where basically the British were taking a lot of resources from their South Asian colonies in order to get a lot of resources to fund the war effort in Europe, which then caused there to be a huge famine that killed a huge number of people. And I thought that this was a very interesting short story because it basically takes the structure of a fairy tale. It has this idea of a matronly grandmother character, and she gets requested to do a task, and she rejects the offer. And then she gets asked again, and she rejects the offer. So there's this idea of sets of three, this idea that she gets demanded to do a thing, she rejects, and then a thing happens, and there's a punishment, or the antagonist sort of strikes back until the grandmother is sort of forced to relent. and it's about this doll maker. The grandmother is a doll maker that makes these very exquisite dolls that sort of dance and laugh and stuff. And then when she has pretty much lost everything, she then accepts the offer, and then it becomes this idea of imbuing the doll with her wrath. It was a super interesting story, and I really liked that sort of fairy tale quality in it. But I also liked that it was set in a sort of modern time, like not modern time, but like the World War II era, so it wasn't like an ancient fairy tale, it was more contemporary. And I also liked that it had this this idea of magic being something that lives inside your own culture and lives inside your own way of life. It's very similar in approach to The Red Magician by Lisa Goldstein, which imagines this magic system that evokes Jewish beliefs. So this was similar in that sense. There was this resemblance that I really liked. Yeah, I really enjoyed this story a lot, and it was my second pick for the Hugo short story category. So yeah, those were the single short stories that I read. And then I read Intelligence, Artificial and Human, 8 science fiction tales by Japanese authors. And this was a bit of a mixed bag. I liked some of the stories a lot, and some of the stories I didn't like at all. For example, Taiyo Fuji's story, which I was expecting to be like a standout, was probably my least favorite of the whole bunch. Like, I didn't think that there was much of a point. It was just like a vignette of... like, it felt like the opening scene from an unnamed anime series, and it just didn't go anywhere. And I was like, okay. But let's see. My favorite story was The Clearing Robot by Motoko Arai. I think this story was the perfect example of a story that I was expecting in this collection, like a story about artificial intelligence and how it relates to actual people. So it's about this woman, an author, who gets a cleaning, not a cleaning robot, but a clearing robot whose whole function is to put things into neat piles. But it doesn't go exactly as planned, because you need to train the robot to be able to clear the right items. So it becomes this question of, is the clearing robot actually a useful thing? Is it actually doing its job, or is it training the person to clear the space, in a sense? So that was interesting. I noticed that a lot of the authors liked to use first-person narration, and in some cases it didn't work, and like the stories felt sort of like self-inserts, basically. There was another story that I really liked. Oh, there. My 6 Months with Taku by Tadashi Ota, which was about this robot that was brought to an elementary school to make friends, and how the children treat the robot, and sort of like this morality of how we treat other people, and what artificial intelligence can learn from that. So those two were the standout short stories in this collection for me. The other ones were not, in my opinion, something to write home about. That may be a little harsh, but that's how I feel. So yeah. And finally, let's talk about the novels that I read. I read 2 in July. So the first was In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. I really liked it. I gave it like a glowing review. I made a full standalone review video for it. I really adored this book. It is a memoir, but it's also a media analysis. It is a poetic, like, sort of, it transcends what a memoir is, basically. It is very, like, poetic. It explores various ways of storytelling. It deals with media analysis and media theory, but also it examines ideas of, like, what relationships are, and especially what toxic relationships are, and how our history as queer people doesn't equip us to identify and to navigate and to distance ourselves or extricate ourselves from a toxic relationship when we get into one. So that was like such a good book. It is not for everyone. I think that it is very stylistic and experimentative, and yeah, so it definitely you need to be in a very specific mindset, and you need to be a very specific type of reader to enjoy it, but I thoroughly love that book. And then I read Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. This was my first foray into reading romance, and I friggin' adored that book. I became obsessed with it. I read it in like a single day. Then for the next 4 days or so, every morning before I had my coffee, I would just sit on the couch and read all of the sex scenes in that book. Because I am that sort of person. And like all of the like romantic scenes, I would just be there like, yep, just reading them. And as someone who deals with chronic pain, it was very it was wonderful to see Chloe as a character, like living her best life and doing things and like trying to combat that cabin fever and that need to stay inside and not be a burden, so to speak, and trying to navigate that need to stay safe and like not take up space in like people spaces. I can't, like, if you have experienced that for yourself, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That idea where you stop spending time with friends because you don't want to be a burden to your friends, and you don't want your friends to be like it's hard to explain. I just loved Chloe's character so much. And yeah, I just saw a lot of parallels between Chloe and Red's relationship, between like my own relationship. So that was also very interesting. So yeah, I truly loved that book. I will say the last third confrontation and conflict I could have done without. I understand from a character point of view why that was there, but I felt that it was rushed and it didn't need to be there. Could have been a 5-star book without that bit. Now it was a 4.5-star book. So there. And yeah, that was everything. This has been a long ass wrap up. I think we are clocking in on an hour. Oh my god. But I hope that you stuck around. If you managed to reach this far, please put a fire emoji down in the comments so I know that you were here and you were listening. Have you read any of these books, stories, comics that I mentioned? If you have, which were your favorites? What did you think of them? And if you would like to support my channel, I will leave links to my print shop where I sell my art prints in case you want to browse and maybe purchase yourself or a friend an art print. And with that, I bid you adieu until the next video. See you then. Bye bye!